Here are the procedures for factoring and solving quadratic equations. You know how to factor from Algebra 1. The difference now is that you have an equal sign and an equal to 0. So the first thing you have to do is you have to make sure that your equation is set equal to 0. So this first equation is number 1 on the front, and it is set equal to 0, so from there we want to factor. If it's not set equal to 0, you have to move over what's on the right side, move it over to the left so that it is equal to 0 by using the opposite operation. I'll show you one of those for problem number 12. Once you have it set equal to 0, make sure it's in descending order. That means that your exponents go down by 1. So here you have 2, 1, 0. So it's in descending order based on the exponents. You set up your two sets of parentheses. K squared breaks down into K and K. 7 breaks down into 7 and 1. Your signs are plus plus, so your signs here have to be plus plus. You can always check your factoring by foiling. 1 times 7 is 7. 1 plus 7 gives you 8 in the middle. So step 2 was to factor. Step 3 is to set each factor, that would be what's inside the parentheses, equal to 0. Set each factor equal to 0. So here's your first factor, so we set that equal to 0. Here's our second factor, and we set that equal to 0. And we solve each of these for, in this case, k. To solve this equation for k, you subtract 1 on both sides, and you get k is equal to -1. Here you're going to subtract 7 on both sides, and you get k is equal to -7. So your two answers are -1 and -7. 95% of the time, as long as there isn't a coefficient, a number in front of this k squared, it'll just be the opposite of what's inside of these factors, but it's always a good idea to set each equal to 0 and then solve. So we set each factor equal to 0, and then we solved for the variable. You do have to remember that when you do factor these, that you have all your methods of factoring. So this was guess and check using a trinomial. In this example, we only have 2 terms, so we can't separate it or break it into 2 sets of parentheses because there's no end term, last term from when you FOIL. So one of the other methods to remember how to factor would be guess and check, which we used, and then the first one that you should always start with would be the GCF. Here we didn't have a GCF, so that's why we didn't factor that out. Both terms have an n in common, so we pull out an n, and we're left with n minus 6 is equal to 0. That was step 1, it's already set equal to 0. Step 2 was to factor. Step 3 is to set each factor equal to 0. So this n is a factor, so you have n is equal to 0, and then you have n minus 6 is equal to 0. Here, you don't have to do anything to get n by itself, so n equals 0 is one of the solutions. For this equation, you would add 6 to both sides to get n by itself, so your two factors are 0 and 6. Because these equations all have 2 as an exponent, you should always have 2 answers. For the last one, notice that it's not set equal to 0, so we have to move this -60 over, and we have to move this -32 over, this +32 over. To do that, we need to use the opposite operation, so I'm going to add 60 to both sides, and then I'm going to subtract 32n. On the right side, they cancel and you're left with 0. On the left, I want to make sure that I write it in descending order, so I'm going to start with this 4n squared minus 32n, and then plus 60. You notice n squared and no n's. Now it's time to factor it. My GCF, what number can I divide each of these by? In this case would be a 4, so I'm going to pull that out first. That'll just make factoring easier for you. So when I pull out a 4, I'm left with n squared minus 8n plus 15. And you can always check by distributing to make sure that you factored out correctly. So 4 times n squared is 4n squared, 4 times -8 is -32, and 4 times 15 gives you 60. Now we're going to factor. N squared breaks down into n and n. I need factors of 15 that give me 8 in the middle. So the factors of 15 would be 5 and 3. My signs are minus plus, so my signs have to be minus minus. Negative 5 times negative 3 gives me positive 15 on the end. Negative 5 plus negative 3 gives me negative 8 in the middle. So that's how I know I factored correctly. This 4 drops down. So we have it set equal to 0. We have it factored. Now we're going to set each factor equal to 0. So I have n minus 5 is equal to 0. Here you have n minus 3 is equal to 0. Solving, I get n is equal to 5 and n is equal to 3. So my two solutions would be 3, 5. Those would be the solutions. You may be curious as to where this 4 went. You could say that 4 equals 4. That's not going to do anything for you because that 4 is considered a factor. Or you can look at if you divide both sides by 4, 4 divided by 4 is 1. And if you divide by 4 on the right, 0 divided by 4 is still 0. That's why you don't have to worry about it. Continue working on the front of the worksheet and try and factor those. When you're done, you can check your answers on my website.